Welcome, I'm Dr. Kevin Hadley, and this is the Board Game Professor. Again, if you haven't watched our introductory video, a quick brief overview is that we are trying to review games from an educational point of view, not just a fun point of view. I'll review it in that context too, but what can games teach us, and how can we use games to facilitate our teaching? Whether you're a college professor, a high school teacher, or even just a parent who wants to teach their children different things. And so today, our first video, our first game that we're reviewing is Pandemic by Matt Leacock, publisher Z-Man Games. Why have I chosen Pandemic as the first one? Well, because we've been using this since 2013 to teach engineers how to work in teams. So I figured this was the most appropriate to kind of set the stage, get things rolling, almost like a pilot of this web series. So let's kind of get into it. If you don't know how to play the game, we have another video going over the broad themes of the game. We also have some videos on how to play the game. This is specifically what can the game teach you, how can you use the game to teach those things, and how good is it at teaching those things. So the main thing that Pandemic teaches you is teamwork. It's kind of there, it's obvious because it's a cooperative game, and most cooperative games are set up for good teamwork development, but there's so many different aspects of teamwork. It's important to kind of dive into what does Pandemic explicitly teach us about teamwork. Okay, so one of the things that Pandemic teaches us that I think is really effective, very important, is through skill diversity. Okay, so why am I holding up these cards? Well, because each player has these different roles. We have a researcher and a dispatcher here. And it's not so much skill diversity, but also skill synergy. Okay, how the skills of one role really feeds into the skills of another and vice versa. And I think this game really displays that well. There are a lot of games that have different superpowers and such, but this game, I think, does this, interconnected synergy between roles so well. And we've seen this in our literature, we've seen this in our research when, that we'll put into the literature. When we've talked to students who have played this game in 2013, that was one of the ones that really stuck with them, was how well this game teaches skill diversity and the strengths, and utilizing the strengths and weaknesses of different players or team members. And so that's a big one. And so if you take this kind of example of the dispatcher and researcher, well, the dispatcher can move people around and get people in the same town. Well, the researcher can give their cards to other players as long as they're in the same town. And so it's sometimes difficult for the researcher to be in the same town as another player, but the dispatcher can help that. So the dispatcher puts the researcher in a town with another player, the researcher can feed that player cards, and the cures are developed that much faster. And this is just an example, but there's so many different combinations that just work really well within this game. And so I think, and when we look at freshman engineering students and their reflections based on this game, that's the one thing that consistently comes up is, oh, we utilized our roles and that just worked really well. So I think it teaches that really well. It's so blatantly out there. They don't have to really think about that one. It's just there, and you see the value right away. So that's a good one. Another one is group decision making. So this is opposed to individual decision making or group thinking. Group thinking like, okay, it's kind of like cult thinking, like, oh, well, we should do this. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Somebody came up with an idea. Now, group decision making is where everybody comes in to help come to a consensus to make decisions. And in the game, that typically comes in the form of like, okay, this is what I'm proposing for my move. What's everybody else's thought? Or, oh man, we have all these things to do. How should we go about this? And so making decisions as a group collectively, getting consensus on things rather than just kind of doing your own thing or whatever. This is another one that it does well, and what I like about this game is that if you don't really prompt your students, or prompt your children in this case, that one is one that falls apart if they don't think about it. If they're typically not getting consensus from their team members, this is one where like, oh, well, we just kind of did our own thing. Well, how'd that work out for you? Pretty terrible. So on a reflective exercise, this group decision-making one is, by hitting it home, they start to really see the value of that in this nice low-risk setting. So group decision-making is another one that it can teach. And I think it teaches it well. Communication is a third one. So communication. Now there are a lot of other co-op games and other games that are really good at teaching communication. So when I say Pandemic's the best at teaching communication, no, but I think it does in conjunction with everything else, it does help. It promotes effective communication, especially if you have private hands. See, if you have public hands, there's not as much need for communication because you can kind of just, come up with plans and be like, hey, I'm going to do this. This is what I'm thinking and why I'm thinking it. Okay. But when the hands are private, you have to communicate, oh, well, I have Sydney and I have Jakarta. But it's more than just I have Sydney and Jakarta. It's, okay, you have that. What does that mean? And how can we move forward with that information? And this game helps practice articulating information that is known. That's really what we're kind of getting down to on communication. Like teamwork, communication has so many different aspects. And so really the aspect that you're getting out of here is articulating the information available. Not just here's the information, but how can that information be used? What does that information mean? And how does it fit into the decisions that you're making? So does that good. And then finally, equal contribution. What I mean by that is that everybody participates. Everybody has an equal role to play, especially with the skill diversity. But, so the fact that there's not overlap between kind of skills and such, everybody has the opportunity to shine. But from an equal contribution point of view, now, yes, you could run into what we call quarterbacking issues, where you have one person telling everybody else what to do. Okay, but just like a football team, you can't just have a quarterback. You have to have a linebacker and a running back and a wide receiver and some other positions. I'm not exactly a football expert, but for those of you who know about football, you probably know what I'm talking about. And here's a nice teaching moment for your children, is that, even if they are left fielder or whatever the bad position is in baseball, they're still playing an important role. They might not be the pitcher, they might not be the catcher, they might not be the first baseman, but as the right fielder, they're still playing an important role. And that's a good lesson, an important lesson that we can teach our children, is, you might not be, the center of attention, but without you, the team falls apart. Same thing here. It's like, okay, the researcher might not be the, glorious person. They're kind of a support role. Same thing with dispatcher. They're kind of a support role. They're not treating disease. They're not, developing the cures. I mean, they might be, but that's not their, special ability. It's not tied to that. But they are facilitating that in such a good way that without them, the team would fall apart. Without them, it would be so much harder. And so I think from an equal contribution component, this is a nice teaching moment for your kids, especially if they think that, oh, well, I'm the right fielder. Am I really playing an important part? Absolutely. You're on the team. You're playing an important part. And so, and you can't have really social loafers where, oh, I'm on the team, but I'm not really doing anything. That's what a social loafer is. That's a term from the literature. And what that comes into play, especially for engineering teams, but probably other teams too, is, okay, that student learns that they can't just ride the coattails of the really smart kid. Okay, again, everybody has a role to play and everybody has to contribute. Okay, so those I would say are the four main things that this game can teach. What can't this game teach? Some might think, oh, well, isn't there kind of problem solving? Yeah, there is. But it's pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward. I mean, there is task planning, so I would say that's kind of like a sub thing, is task planning, because you've got these clear goals. Okay, treat disease, cure the disease, or find the cure. And there are tasks that need to lead to make sure all the pieces fall together appropriately. So task planning is probably a good supplementary one. It's not one that has to be taught. It's something, though, that can be taught. But problem solving or critical thinking, I wouldn't put this game in that realm. There are much better games to teach those skills in a different context. Another one that you would definitely not teach with this is anything to do with disease spread or infection models or anything like that. It overly simplifies the model of how an infection works, how a disease spreads. I mean, all you're saying is, hey, there's a critical mass to a population and eventually it'll explode in terms of outbreaks. I mean, I saw this on a forum on the BoardGameGeek.com, and it just, I don't think it aligns really well. And so that's not something I would use this game to teach. Now, to teach those things, is there another game out there? Maybe, maybe not, but there's probably better methods to teach that thing. The whole point of games in education and game-based learning is to facilitate the teaching, not replace the teaching. And so this is augmenting how you're teaching teamwork, equal contribution, the importance of skill diversity, so on and so forth, not to replace it. It's okay, I'm going to still teach you what equal contribution looks like, but we're going to use the game to put things into context, to give you perspective on what I mean by these technical terms. And so something like biology doesn't really fit here. So those are the main things that I would say. Let's see, looking at my notes, there's a couple of nice features, in terms of worker play. You got workers, you've got, these things that are intensifying, so kind of adds stress to it, and that changes things up, and they add to the value of what you're trying to teach. So that's what I would teach. That's what I would not teach. Specifically for younger children, it depends upon how many games do you as a family play. If you play a lot of games, they probably could pick up a game like Pandemic by the age of 10, okay? Because they're familiar with how games work and how they flow and all these other things. But even like 7 and 8, I mean, I have a 7-year-old at home, and we play a lot of games. I don't know if she could really get a good handle of this. There are other games out there, specifically Forbidden Island and Forbidden Desert, also by Matt Leacock. I can't remember the publisher, though, off the top of my head. But those are similar mechanics that are much more simplified so that they can kind of get their head around it a lot easier. So, but again, I'm not a child psychologist. I am not a child development expert. I'm an engineering education expert. So those are just my opinions on it. Looking at the game as a whole in terms of production value, I think it's good. It's got these nice plastic pieces for the disease cubes. It's got symbology instead of just colors for the towns. Now, if you're colorblind, you can't tell the difference between the different cubes, but for the most part, it does a pretty good job. The cards are, we play this game every semester with 3 different departments, and the game lasts pretty long as you don't bend the cards. So production value is pretty good, but what makes production value really nice is how cheap it is. It's only $40, so so that's a really nice thing. Plays within a quick amount of time. Let's see here, what else do I talk about? Oh, it's pretty fun. And it's not too complex. It's a little complex. Again, 8 and below, I wouldn't, 9 and below, I wouldn't really suggest this. And even 10, they're not really used to games. I've used this with freshmen and sophomores in high school, but the only games they ever played was something like Monopoly. And so they also had a tough time kind of getting their head around this. Now, they were But I've also done this with honor students from high school, and they had no problems. So I think it just kind of depends upon, when it comes to high school, it depends upon the audience. And it's important to be aware of that audience, is really the thing. I think that's the most part. So let's go through the grade sheet. So for every game, I'm going to give each category a grade of how well I think Pandemic stands up. So on the grade, the category of alignment. Okay, so what does this teach, and how well does it teach, and how well does it align with what you're trying to teach? So in terms of teaching school diversity and all those things, I give it an A-. I think it does a really good job with certain ones. It does an okay job with others. So it teaches a lot, but not a ton. But some of the things that it does teach, it teaches really well. So it could be a little bit better, but it's, you know, it's up there. It's definitely a very high quality game with respect to what it can teach and how it can teach it. And I know that because I've been doing this since 2013, and so we've seen the impact it can have on students. I would say the one thing that we've noticed is that it may not teach them how to work in groups, or how to utilize people's skills. I think that takes a little bit more time and experience. What it does teach them, though, is that that's an important thing to learn. Okay, it teaches them to appreciate the value of skill diversity. So that's something it does really well. Theme, A, easily an A. Now, why is it not an A+? Well, so the theme is you're trying to save people, you know, from disease, and that's such an approachable thing. I can't think of anybody who really wouldn't like this, except for one. I remember seeing, it was either a student I had or somebody commenting how they had there was a student whose mother was from Africa. She was she immigrated here when she was 6. Her mother passed away when she was, you know, before that. That's why she immigrated here. She passed away because of some disease like, you know, like Ebola or something in Africa due to an epidemic. And so it was a little bit more personal for her in that specific context. And so that's why I can't get an A+, because it's not a theme for everyone. But it's pretty darn close. Complexity. Like I said before, it's not too complex, but it kind of is. It's the rules itself. I mean, I think it's let's see here. I think it's about 6 pages. No, yeah, it's about 8 pages. 8 pages. So it's an 8-page rule book, which is pretty manageable. You know, and it does have a lot of pictures and stuff, which is nice. But there are some like kind of specific rules that aren't super clear, or even if they were clear, they're kind of like wonky. Especially like how outbreaks could trigger other outbreaks, and there's some other like kind of specific situation things that are hard to kind of get your head around, especially if you've never played a co-op or anything like that. So it's not overly complex, but it's not something that you can just dive into in like 2 minutes. It does kind of take a time to get your head around it, but I think once you start playing it, it's easy to get, you know, your head around it. It's those specific things like epidemics and outbreaks that make things kind of tricky. Let's see here. Time. 40-minute game if everybody plays, you know, at a reasonable rate. Now, you can suffer from analysis paralysis. That happens. It's not too bad. I've seen much worse games in terms of analysis paralysis. This one's not too bad. So if they're pretty good about, like, you know, keeping the game moving, you can easily get this done within a classroom. And so I give that an A-. It could be shorter, but it's pretty darn good. From a fun point of view, I give it an A-. From an educational point of view. From me personally, do I really like this game? It's more of a B+. But I'm grading this based on its educational value and how fun it would be for the students. So, it is fun. I think, you know, the students really get into it. I've seen a couple of students who have resistance to it, but I think it's more the activity rather than the game itself. I think any game they would have resistance to. So that's in, and there's things like the complexity and such that lower it, from like an A or A plus, but A minus. And then cost, it's $40. And cheaper, some places online, but MSRP, go down to Target or whatever, it's $40, and that's pretty reasonable. It actually is very reasonable. So that's a really nice price. So you can buy a lot of copies for your classroom, or if you're bringing home, $40 is totally worth the investment. Obviously, it could be cheaper, so that's why it's an A minus, not higher, but it's pretty darn good. Now, so as a educational tool, how do I grade this? Well, averaging all those things up, I'd say an A minus. Could it be better? Absolutely. There's a lot of things that it could teach better, or that could be better about its time and stuff like that. But for the most part, this is a really solid game. It teaches a lot, and it teaches it pretty darn well. Now, stepping away from taking off my mortarboard, so to speak, and reviewing this as a board gamer, production value, I gave it a B plus. There are things that could be better. The cards could be a little bit more hardier. The plastic bags that the pieces come in are the worst on the planet. I mean, these I went and bought myself because they tear open like within 2 uses. So, but it keeps the cost down, so I can't complain too much. But looking at production value just as a whole, it could be better, but it's not too bad. And then replayability is a big one for me. It's there, so I gave it a B. It could be better. To me, it's like after you played it a couple of times, it's kind of the same game. It doesn't matter that, but Buenos Aires is saturated now. Well, so that's kind of, how much different is that from Jakarta being saturated? And so, like a traditional card game like Pinnacle or Euchre or something, yeah, it's different every game, but it's the strategies and the choices and everything and the dynamics really don't change that much. The main thing that kind of accounts for the replayability is the roles that you play, not really which towns are saturated or not saturated. I mean, that creates a sense of randomness and change, but I think it really boils down to the dynamics of how players interact with each other, and that's usually through the roles. So there's only so many combinations of roles, but if you play a game with a researcher and a dispatcher, it's a pretty similar game every time. And so I gave that a B. As a whole, I'm not a big co-op fan. It's funny. It's kind of ironic considering how long I've been using this game to teach engineers how to work in teams. But me personally, I'm just not a co-op fan. I like co-op games, but they're not my favorite genre of game. That might be influencing my opinion of it as a game, but for the most part, it's a B. It's good. Could be better. Well, in any case, I hope you learned something. If you have any questions about, hey, well, I'm thinking about using this in my classroom, or I want to teach my teenager the importance of being, the shortstop on the baseball team, whatever. Leave some comments. You can subscribe to the web series to see more videos like this. Next time I'm thinking Stone Age. So if you want to know more about what can Stone Age teach my children or my students, watch that video. And again, for all these games, we're going to have a video on how they play, the explicit rules, and then how I think they could be used in the classroom or in an educational setting to teach something. So, until next time, again, I am Dr. Kevin Hadley, and this has been the Board Game Professor. Thank you.